Hi, I'm Charles Hoskinson, and I'd like today to talk a little bit about the future, namely the future given to us by something that can decentralize it. So I'm a mathematician, and as a mathematician, we like to do things like Venn diagram everything. We like to build our models. So let's break the world up into two buckets. Let's look at the banked and documented world, and let's look at the unbanked and undocumented world. So the green bucket has about 4 billion people living in it, in places like the United States, the European Union. And then we look at places like China, we look at places like India and Brazil, and we start moving into the unbanked and undocumented world, places like Sudan, places like Afghanistan. Well, what's the point? Well, the point is, if you were to look at every meaningful metric, from infant mortality to literacy rates, quality of life, it tends to get better with the more financial services and the more access to documentation that you tend to have. So let's elucidate this a bit with an example. Let's take a look at two people. Let's meet Jeremy. He likes cereal. He's about 30 years old, and he's born in the United States. He has access to a passport, driver's license, birth certificate. He has credentials. He went to a university. Not a very good one, but he still has a university. He has a good work history. He owns a house. He's got a car. He's probably like somebody everybody knows. Now let's take a look at his financial history. Well, he has a bank account. He's borrowed money before, and he had to pay for that house and that car. He has several insurance policies, so if he hits you with his car, if his house burns down, if he gets sick, he has the means to cover that via proxies. And he's a very good son. He sends money to his mother in Indiana every single month, so we like Jeremy. And he's currently engaged in several contracts. You can just have them how you will. And he buys lots of stuff on Amazon and on eBay, okay? So now let's meet Hamid Khan. He's a slightly different person. He's in the other circle. So Khan is born in Afghanistan. He's between 45 to 44 years old. We're not entirely sure. He doesn't have any formal documentation. Khan has learned several trades, but it's very difficult to understand his work history. Furthermore, he lives on undeeded land, which means that where his house is, where he lives, he has no documentation that he actually owns that. Let's say he's lived there for 2 decades. He still doesn't. He uses a bicycle for transportation, and he has a very difficult to verify criminal history. What does it mean for the Taliban, for example, to say you're a criminal? So let's take a look at his financial life. He lives in a cash economy. Everything is cash. All of his money he takes with him. His credit comes from friends and family. All of his assets are obviously uninsured. He receives money from his brother in India, and that cost him 15 cents on the dollar, the remittance cost. All of his agreements are verbal, and he has absolutely no access to the internet. This is the reality for about 3 billion people worldwide. It's a very tough reality. So what are the differences we should focus on? What should we learn from this example? First, Jeremy, he sends his money at a very low cost. It takes only a few days, maybe it's a few percentage points. On the other hand, Ahmed, that's 15%. So let's look at the numbers for everyone. The worldwide remittance business is about $540 billion. 192 million people living away from their home countries send money home, and that total of money is about 400 billion. And the cost of moving that money sits somewhere between 8.6% to 12% on average. It's a World Bank estimate, but it can be much higher depending upon where you live. Try sending money to Syria, for example. Let's look at Jeremy. He has low-cost access to credit. When he gets a loan, he can get a long loan, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, depending upon the asset. And the interest rates are fairly decent, let's say 5% to 10%. Now, even if Hamid Khan had access and a cultural inclination to borrow money, if you look at the global microfinance rates, they're about 35% to 40% interest, according to a CGAP estimate. And Azerbaijan is sitting at the top, Afghanistan sits at the top, and even 35% for South American nations. It's just terrible. If you look at Jeremy, he has the ability to objectively bind contracts, assets, and property like land. When he owns a house, he owns it. He has his deed. He has his car. If he goes to prison for 5 years, he still has assets. They're there waiting for him when he comes back. On the other hand, Ahmed is completely off the grid. So let's imagine something. Let's think about a war breaking out, and the land that you live on, you have to flee. And you come back 5 years later, and there's somebody living on that land. Who owns it? Is it yours? Is it theirs? How do you resolve that dispute? That's a reality that 3 billion people must live in. If you look at the economic cost of this, Hernando de Soto Pilar is a Peruvian economist, good friends with Bill Clinton, he actually sat down and calculated that there's about $10 trillion worth of wealth that's just locked up due to this lack of documentation. This is all wealth that we can unlock, we could exploit, we could do things with. People could actually grow economically, but unfortunately they can't. And finally, this is incredibly important, especially to Bermuda. Jeremy can manage his risk via insurance. Whereas among Han, he has very limited tools at his disposal to protect himself from disasters or risk. If he gets sick, if he dies, there's just no one to cover that. So these are the problems that he lives. These are the problems that billions of people around the world have to deal with on a daily basis. So it's very natural to ask, how do we solve this? What do we do? Let's propose something. Well, my belief is that this technology, this Bitcoin thing that everybody seems to be talking about, actually has inside of it some solutions. And I have my nice little cryptocurrencies. There we go, cryptocurrency, yay. Okay, so I call it the transformative triumvirate, big fan of Roman history. And there's really three things here: blockchains, decentralized transaction systems, and smart contracts. What in the world do I mean? Let's go through them. Let's talk about blockchains first. So basically what a blockchain is it's just a big database. If you're going to store something like who owns what, you need that database to be secure, you need it to be tamper resistant, you need it to be distributed. And it turns out that Bitcoin actually has probably the best distributed database in the world. It solved a very hard computer science problem just to exist. And here's the key. Once you put something in a blockchain like Bitcoin's, it's there forever. It can't come out. We have every single transaction since Bitcoin was invented. It's there since January 3rd, 2009. So that means it's the perfect place to put identities. It's the perfect place to put agreements, property rights, these kinds of things. And it's totally censorship resistant. Even if it's inconvenient data to a government, inconvenient data to an individual, you can't pull it out once it's there. So let's look at some examples of what's already been done. So Namecoin is a project that wants to replace the entire DNS system of the internet. Do you ever wonder why, when you go to Microsoft.com or Google.com, how that all gets sorted out and who owns what? That's ICANN's DNS system. It's a centralized solution. They're based in America, a lot of international participation. Namecoin is saying, let's completely disintermediate everybody. It's a totally decentralized grid where we actually have a new DNS system. BlockSign actually allows you to take contracts like non-disclosure agreements, anything you can think of, and actually verify them and sign them using the Bitcoin blockchain at an incredibly low cost, less than a penny. Now, let's look at the transaction system. This is near and dear to my heart. I've started 2 ventures in the Bitcoin space. Both of them were funded in a distributed fashion. The second one was Ethereum. So this brilliant kid named Vitalik Buterin last year came up with this idea. He wrote this white paper. He's 19 years old. And I read it, and I said, damn it, I have to help him start this because this is brilliant. And we decided to have a fundraiser. So we published a little address, and we said, send a transaction. And over a course of 42 days, 9,011 transactions, we raised $18 million. And the cost to raise that money was only $350 in transaction fees, a price of 0.002%. This is the magic that a young kid who's a college dropout living up in Canada can write a white paper, bring a team together on 4 continents, and within just a matter of months have a fundraiser for over $18 million to get the resources he needed to do something. And this is accessible to everyone. No one controls it. Now let's look at smart contracts. This is really where the magic actually happens. So a contract is basically an agreement having a lawful object entered into voluntarily by 2 or more parties, each of whom intends to create 1 or more legal obligations between them. This is why I'm not a lawyer. I don't like reading those things. So a smart contract says, that's great and all, but you still have to have third parties involved in the verification process, the facilitation process, the enforcement process. What if we could algorithmically do this? What if we could take a contract and write it in some sort of specialized programming language, play around with it for a bit, and this can actually be done over a decentralized grid. And we can have that same immutability and censorship resistance and certainty that we have with our transaction system. Well, it's not a new idea. David Chaum and Nick Szabo first thought of it back in the 1980s and 1990s, and that brilliant kid, Vitalik Buterin, and another brilliant kid who works for a competitor, Ripple, actually came up with a way of doing this using Bitcoin, the Ethereum and the Codis projects. So what does this actually accomplish? Well, you can think of any centralized service that's online, like eBay, you can think of a Dropbox, you can think of exchanges, and you basically can build a decentralized equivalent. You can also think of services like hosting. So You have Amazon EC2, you have rack space. You pay some money, you can use their servers. Well, what if, just like folding at home, where they fold proteins, instead of doing that, we can actually tokenize hosting of web services. And people can just leave their laptops on, their desktops on, and make a little bit of money. And the aggregate grid becomes the world's largest web server. Combined with the centralized DNS system, you actually have an entirely new internet. And all of this is actually possible because of smart contracts. So let's bring this all together. Let's bring this back to why we care. We care about Hamed Khan. So what are his problems again? He needs reputation, he needs credit, he needs to be able to manage his risk, he needs low remittance costs, and he would love to be able to actually prove he owns the land that he lives on, especially if he has to flee it. Well, blockchains enable him to build a censorship-resistant, always accessible digital history. Everything that he does, if he does it through a blockchain-based solution, it's there forever, and it's completely disintermediated from his government. So it doesn't matter who's in charge, what's going on, the particular political whims, it's there. And I can see that, and I can start building things like credit metrics and risk metrics on that. Okay. Second, just like me, his brother can now send things at much less than a penny. And if you think of that $540 billion remittance market with 12% going to middlemen, it's going less than a penny, less than 1%. It's a beautiful thing. And finally, because we have these smart contracts, we can start talking about building microfinance and microinsurance, decentralized networks. What does that mean? Think of Kiva, think of Lending Club, think of the Grameen Bank, and imagine if they had some sort of Frankenstein child. But that Frankenstein child is completely peer-to-peer. Anybody can access it. They can use it at a low cost. And now you, anyone, can go ahead and click on someone, send them $100, and actually get repaid through that network and have a 90 or 95% repayment. That's the beautiful emergent properties of having reputation combined with a money transaction system combined with programmable finance. That's what you get for that. The same deal for microinsurance. You can take a lot of innovation that's been done recently for poor nations and actually have insurance policies that are $50 or $100 and make them profitable. And once you actually have a set of these things, you can securitize them. So it's a very promising emerging field. So there's one last problem, and this is kind of the kicker. Only 40% of the world's population is online, which seems to be a little low, but when you think about the age of the internet, that's actually quite amazing that something has grown so fast. So how do we get internet to Hamed Khan? Well, in just the same way that we can build a decentralized lending network, in just the same way we can build a decentralized insurance network, we can also actually build a decentralized ISP. So you can actually use technologies like CJDNS combined with old hardware like Wi-Fi routers and cell phones and just a little bit of hacking and finagling, and people can become micro ISPs. Just like they can mine Bitcoin, they can now provide internet services to their local community. And there are several other solutions to getting it without necessarily having to use the internet proper. For example, BitPesa, based in Kenya, is trying to find a way to distribute Bitcoin solutions across the cell phone, which makes sense because they have a digital currency there called M-Pesa. And finally, BitNation is probably the most ambitious. They're actually building a global network of ambassadors that are going to provide a full suite of services. So it's a very rich field. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But one thing I do know is that the future is going to be decentralized, just like TED. Thank you.